Okay, in this lecture we'll talk about two sections. One is from chapter 1, section 3, and then from there we'll skip ahead a little bit and go to chapter 2, subsection 3.3. Because in chapter 2, subsection 3.3, there's an example of statistical analysis, and it's a good example of the issues dealt with in this chapter 1, section 3. Okay, so here in chapter 1, section 3, our objectives are to explain how economists test hypotheses, develop theories, and use models. 2, explain what they call the all other things changed problem. We have a Latin expression for this, and it's written here, ceteris paribus. So it sounds sometimes better to speak Latin than say all other things unchanged. Call it ceteris paribus. That's the Latin expression that means the same thing. We'll talk about why that is important. And also the fallacy of false cause. So these are all problems that could result when trying to test economic hypotheses. And then finally, we'll distinguish between normative and positive statements, which is, again, a simple, like the difference between micro and macroeconomics. This distinction is also pretty straightforward. But one thing that's not straightforward is understanding how economists test hypotheses. So it's important that we'll be talking about variables. And in the Excel assignment, number 1, variable is something that can change. So for example, we mentioned a macroeconomic concept in the last video, unemployment. The unemployment rate changes over time, right? Now let me give you an example from microeconomics. The price of gasoline changes over time. So that's a variable. When we're analyzing data, we often have measures of certain characteristics of the economy or markets, and we call those variables. So we will be analyzing data, and we'll talk about the different variables in that data. The scientific method is something that you probably learned about in elementary school. But to remind ourselves of what it is, a systematic set of procedures through which knowledge is created. So generally, we have a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an assertion of a relationship between two or more variables that could be proven to be false. So we can test this hypothesis. If we get data, we can see whether our hypothesis is true. And so one example is increased solar radiation increases the rate of plant growth. So we could run an experiment, right, where we have two gardens. One has a higher level of solar radiation than the other. And we could see which grows faster, right? If we find that high levels of solar radiation actually kill plants, then we could disprove our hypothesis. This example does highlight one of the difficulties of economic analysis, however, because in economics it's not usually possible to conduct experiments. And so normally what we'll do is use data from the real world and look for relationships in the data, but that means we're not able to draw strong causal inferences from the data because it's not experimental data. So you've heard this expression, correlation does not prove causation. Have you heard that expression? Okay, well we'll talk more about it. It is an expression that you should be aware of because oftentimes, say you're watching the evening news and they talk about a new study that found a relationship between two variables. But it's important for us to be aware of whether this relationship is actually causal or if it's merely a relationship. So we'll come back to this in a moment. If we do find that, say, more solar radiation increases plant growth, probably up to a level at least, then we can call it a theory, which is a hypothesis that has not been rejected after widespread testing. And then after extensive testing, if it still has not been rejected, we call it a law. So this description pretty much puts a law at the top level, a theory underneath it, and a hypothesis at the very bottom. And that generally is a reasonable description of the scientific method. I sometimes think about hypotheses as very precise, testable statements, whereas theories are more general, and often a theory will yield multiple hypotheses. Okay, so what about models? Well, we did talk about models in the last lecture, and it's true that other types of scientists use models or think about the world through the lens of models, but among social scientists, probably none of them use models as much as economists. And so why do economists use models? Well, the world out there is very complicated, right? If we want to know what affects the price of gasoline, there are many, many, many factors, right? So if a ship coming from, say, China pulls into the San Francisco or Oakland port and fills up on gasoline, that might cause a small increase in the price, right? So there's many idiosyncratic factors. But the goal of getting a grasp of the question, what affects the price of gasoline, is to abstract away from all the less important factors and focus on only those that are most important. So one of the challenges that people who are new to economics face is letting go of the details. And that's what models help us to do. You might be correct that some factor that you think about affects the price of gasoline. But models focus our attention on only the most important factors. Models can also generate hypotheses. And once we have a hypothesis, we will test it using data. So there are some problems, however, that we must keep in mind when interpreting the results of statistical analysis. For example, the hypothesis that an increase in the price of gasoline produces a reduction in quantity demanded. Okay, let me go back. So here is the hypothesis suggested by the model of supply and demand. I mentioned models generate hypotheses. An increase in the price of gasoline will reduce the quantity of gasoline that consumers demand. Makes sense, right? If the price of gasoline goes up, people are going to buy less gasoline. Yeah? Well, let's collect some data and see if that's true. The average, it turns out, and this is true, the average retail price of gasoline in the US rose from an average of $2.12 in May of 2005 to $2.88 a year later. So the price went up. We think people would probably consume less gasoline, right? That's what the model of supply and demand would tell us. But it turns out the number of gallons of gasoline consumed by US motorists actually rose during that period. So the price went up, and also gasoline consumption went up. So should we reject the hypothesis that an increase in price causes quantity demanded to fall? Probably not. Because there are many things that affect the price of gasoline. And the hypothesis that I stated a moment ago, that when the price of gasoline goes up, quantity demanded goes down, is a little bit incomplete. In other words, we could be more precise if we say, as the price of gasoline goes up, quantity demanded goes down, ceteris paribus. So by saying ceteris paribus, that means as long as nothing else is happening. Because what do you think happened from 2005 to 2006? Yeah?
There are more vehicles on the road.
Right, so the price went up, but there are also more vehicles on the road. And maybe the price went up because there are more vehicles on the road, right? So there, for whatever reason, there were other factors. It wasn't that the price of gasoline went up in isolation. There was a general increase in demand for gasoline probably, right? Because of maybe a booming economy, population growth, and so on, more cars on the road. So both the price went up and the quantity went up. So that is the importance of this expression ceteris paribus. And the statistical techniques that economists have developed are designed, as we said in that last video, about controlling for the effect of gender on earnings when trying to figure out the effect of being an econ major, right? These statistical techniques allow us to make to test ceteris paribus hypotheses. The other statistical problem that we discuss in this section is the fallacy of false cause. And I mentioned earlier this distinction between correlation and causation. That falls under this category of the fallacy of false cause. The best way to illustrate this is with this case in point article, Does Baldness Cause Heart Disease? A website called embarrassingproblems.com received the following email. Dear Dr. Margaret, I seem to be going bald. According to your website, this means I'm more likely to have a heart attack. If I take a drug to prevent hair loss, will it reduce my risk of a heart attack? So, perhaps Dr. Margaret heard on the 6 o'clock news, a new study finds that baldness causes heart attacks. And perhaps the researchers found data on people who went to the hospital, and they found that more people are going to the hospital for heart attacks if they're bald. Something like that. Some relationship that they saw in the data. In other words, a correlation. Talk in a moment about what does it mean, a correlation. But they found that people who have hair loss tend to have more heart attacks. That's a correlation, right? But does it prove that baldness causes heart attacks? No. Generally, correlation does not prove causation. By the way, there is one exception to that. That is when we conduct a randomized controlled experiment. In other words, an experiment. If we do an experiment and say, everything is the same between these two gardens, but one garden gets more sunlight, and then if those plants grow more, we can say more sunlight causes growth. So in order to be confident about the causal claims that we make, we have to do a randomized controlled experiment. But the problem is, for many parts of life, that's not possible, right? Like, we could not induce baldness in some people. Even if it was medically possible, it would not be ethical, right? And then see if they had a higher, right? That would be the way to do a randomized controlled experiment. But that's not ethical, probably not even possible, right? So oftentimes we can't do a randomized controlled experiment. And in those cases, we have to be very careful about the causal claims that we might like to make. So, any ideas about what might be going on? Why is it that people males with baldness have more heart attacks? Maybe they're more stressed, right? Maybe there's a third factor, stress. Maybe this is not what you were thinking, but one possibility is stress causes baldness and also heart attacks, right? Or you might say that because people are bald, they have more stress, and then that causes a heart attack, right? In that case, baldness does sort of cause heart attacks through the channel of stress. And so maybe if we could get them to calm down a little bit, they wouldn't have it. In any case, there could be another factor, like maybe a gene, right? A certain gene that causes both baldness and heart attacks, right? So these are the types of problems that could come up when we talk about statistical analysis. Now, I'm going to skip ahead. We're going to talk about this model next week. This is the model of illustrating the concept of comparative advantage. So I'm not going to go through this yet, but one hypothesis that results from that model impacts the study of comparative economic systems. I did have my phone here a moment ago. Anyone see where I put that? it is. Okay. And here's how. The model of comparative advantage shows that when people or economies specialize and trade, people are better off. In other words, you're better off trading with your neighbor than trying to do everything yourself. If you think back to the old days when people, they baked their own bread, they milked their own cows, and they sewed their own clothes, right? There was a certain standard of living there. But eventually they realized, hey, I'm really good at sewing. So why don't I sew clothes? And my neighbor, he's really good at milking cows. So why doesn't he milk cows, and then I'll give him some clothes and he'll give me some milk, right? When people do that, they turn out to have more of everything. That's what we'll talk about next week. But it also suggests something about how we should design our economy. And this is one of the fundamental debates. There have been wars. Millions of lives have been lost over the debate about what type of economic system should we have. So, to some extent, for my generation and closely behind is your generation, the debate is not as intense as it was, say, in our parents' generation during the Cold War. Right? The Soviet Union was the prominent example of communism, and the United States was the most prominent example of capitalism. And so we can think about economies on this continuum from market capitalist to command socialist. So on one end we have economies that are free trade. Very few restrictions on the types of economic behavior people can engage in. On the other hand, we have command socialist economies. The government will tell you what job you will have. They will tell you how much milk will be produced and everything else. In other words, here we have the government deciding what will be produced and how it will be produced and for whom. These are, by the way, the three fundamental questions from the first section of Chapter 1. They are relevant when comparing economic systems. Whereas here, in market capitalist economies, individuals decide what's going to be produced, how it will be produced, and for whom. So these are the two ends of the spectrum. In fact, no economy has ever been a pure market capitalist economy. And not even the Soviet Union was ever a pure command socialist economy. Right? Because even in the Soviet Union, there were black market transactions. People would make a little extra pot of cabbage rolls and trade it with their neighbor for something. Right? So there were individual exchanges and so on. In other words, all economies are mixed economies. But the question is, are they closer to market capitalist, or are they closer to command socialist? And so remember, we're talking about marginal thinking, right? There still is intense debate in the US and every country. Should we move a little bit to the left? Should we move a little bit to the right? Yeah, or a little bit towards one end of the spectrum or another. This is the stuff of, political debate, as well as classroom discussion. So the model of comparative advantage, however, suggests that being over here is not good. Right? Closer towards market capitalist is good. That's what the model of comparative advantage suggests. Now, we're going to discuss other problems. For example, when people are allowed to do whatever they want, sometimes they cause pollution, and that's bad for society, right? So there are some reasons why we don't want to be all the way over here. But if we just think about the model of comparative advantage, it suggests we should be closer to this end. Now, how might we test that hypothesis? Well, it turns out economists have tried to do this. And I'm going to show you some data now. This is a scatter plot. Remember, I mentioned in your term papers you have to have 3 figures, and one of them has to be a scatter plot. So So you need to create this. You need to find some data and create this. And this is what your Excel assignment 1 is all about. This scatter plot shows two variables. On the x-axis, this is the x-axis or the horizontal axis, you have an index of economic freedom. So there's an organization called the Heritage Foundation that ranks countries based on how close they are to market capitalism. Right? So if you have, it turns out, a low score, it means you are free. Or in other words, you are a highly market capitalist economy. Now, on the y-axis, we have average income. Technically, it's GDP per capita. This is a macroeconomic concept. For this class, I would just say this is average household income. All right? So one of these countries, all of these dots represent a country. And one of these is the United States. Perhaps this country right here. They're not labeled, but it might be this country right here. What we see is that we have a high level of economic freedom and also a high level of average income. Right? And so when you look at this scatter plot, it appears that there's a relationship between these two, right? Certainly, it appears that there's a correlation because more freedom corresponds with more income. So it would seem that there's support for that hypothesis. But as we mentioned before, there are a lot of problems. The ceteris paribus problem, the fallacy of false cause problem that we should be aware of before we make the conclusion that freedom causes income growth or high incomes. Okay? All right, so I will quickly relate this chapter 2, section 3 to your Excel assignment. So this is the Excel document. When you download this data, when you open up this worksheet, you will see that for every country we have 2013 score. This is the Economic Freedom Index score. And then we also have over here GDP per capita. So we don't need any, there's a lot of other variables here, right? We don't need these. We can delete them. And what we want to do is create a scatter plot of these two variables. Notice for some countries, like Afghanistan, they have not calculated an economic freedom index. You might be able to guess why they could not find data for that country. So one thing you can do is get rid of these missing values by sorting from largest to smallest. And unfortunately, we don't have data on them. We can't analyze them, so we can delete them. And then we may not have data on all countries' GDP per capita. We don't have North Korea GDP per capita, so we'll delete them. But otherwise, we do have data on these two variables. And we can create a scatter plot quite simply. Insert, scatter. So the figure I just created looks like this figure, doesn't it?
What about the curve?
But what about the curve? So we want to fit a line in there. What you do is take your mouse, put it over one of the dots, and right-click, and click Add Trend Line. And then you can pick one of these shapes if you want. But what I would ask you to do is just pick a linear relationship. Click Display Equation on Chart and display R-squared value. And close. And now you see that there's an upward sloping line. And you have the relationship. So we can use this equation to predict average income in a country. If we know the x value, what's the x variable? Economic freedom. And so notice this is a positive, right? So if we have more economic freedom, then we have, the thing that's confusing here is lower values of x are associated with more freedom. So it actually should be called an economic, what's the opposite of freedom? Restrictor, right? It should be actually an economic restriction index. And so those economies with, wait a second, I'm confusing myself. In any case, that is the type of analysis. Let me come back to this in a second, but this is the way that you will complete the Excel assignment. I think that the score, somehow it seemed to be different in the book. No, I misspoke. More freedom, higher score means more freedom. And what do we see here? What country or what economy has the most economic freedom? Is it the United States? No, Hong Kong. Followed by Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canada. US is number 10. But anyway, there are many, many countries below the United States, right? So we're still high up there. Okay, the other aspect of the Excel assignment requires you to think about the role of government in a market economy. So, even though free market economies tend to be wealthier, as we see, it doesn't mean that we necessarily want to get rid of all government. As it says here, all nations rely on government to provide defense, enforce laws, redistribute income. It's not to say that there's no role for government. In fact, if you have no government, perhaps you have a weaker education system, more pollution, and maybe these things bring down growth. So someone else might have the hypothesis that more government leads to higher income. And you're going to test that hypothesis also, just like I tested the hypothesis that less government relates to more growth. You're going to test a different hypothesis, and then you'll conclude which results you find more compelling. Or in other words, which hypothesis do you think there's more support for? All right, so that's the end of this video lecture, and we'll carry on with Chapter 2 next.